Member Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and it is a pleasure to rise and speak on the student loan bill. As other Labor speakers have indicated, we are supporting this bill, albeit with some concerns about a couple of matters that I will go into in a moment. But first I wanted to respond to some of the comments that have been made during the debate, and I wanted to start with my colleague Gareth Hughes from the Green Party. And just to make clear that on the Labor side of the House, we are in fact very proud of the changes that Labor made to the student loan scheme when we were in office, because I was a borrower in the student loan scheme when we were charged interest on our borrowings while we were studying, while we had absolutely no means of being able to pay back. And it created this phenomenon called flat spotting, which meant that you could earn money, but the interest would keep going up and you couldn't pay it off. And so Labor made sure that we removed interest on student loans while you were studying. And then we moved on to remove interest completely from student loans. And so I am actually proud of that. I am proud that that is an achievement that has made it much easier for people to pay off their loans. It's worked to try and keep graduates in New Zealand. That was actually the purpose of it, was to incentivise people staying in New Zealand, because interest is still charged when a borrower is overseas. And we also made tertiary education more affordable generally. We introduced the fee maxima policy. I sat on a university council in New Zealand in the mid-1990s, and one year fees went up by 18%, and the next year fees went up by 15%. That made it really difficult for people to afford tertiary education. So when Labor came into office, we introduced the fee maxima policy, which meant that institutions couldn't put their fees up by more than 5% a year, and that demonstrably helped students by keeping the cost of their education down. We also extended, Mr Speaker, the eligibility to student allowances, which means fewer people borrowing from the student loan scheme, and that was something that was very important to the academic success and welfare of many students. So I say to Mr Hughes that while he may have ideals for further changes to the way tertiary education is funded, and I too want to see it become more affordable, I think the Labor government's record on this in the last term of office was something to be proud of. In terms of Sir Roger Douglas, it's a familiar speech that we heard from Sir Roger, and my only response to it would be that the reason why I support investing in tertiary education is so that the children of the truck driver from Otara can have a tertiary education. Why should we limit their opportunities? We need to invest in tertiary education so everybody has the chance to improve themselves, no matter where they come from. But tertiary education, in my mind, and I know Sir Roger will disagree with this, is a public good for the most part. And in the mid-1990s, the Todd Commission that looked into tertiary education tried to come up with a balance between the public and the private good in tertiary education. And the truth is there isn't a scientific formula for that. But the reality is that we all benefit from tertiary education because we benefit from having people with skills who can then go on to be part of our productive economy. It is an investment in all of our futures. It is especially an investment in the future of someone who comes from a background where they may not have the resources themselves to pay to go to tertiary education. I think we should have the ambition for the people from Otara to be able to be part of the tertiary education system, and that's why we need to invest in it, rather than trying to see it portrayed as some kind of middle-class benefit. Mr Speaker, I do now want to return to the bill itself and say, as other speakers have said, I was responding, Mr Hipkins, to comments in the debate, but to return to the bill itself, as other speakers have said, there are some good elements in this bill, and I particularly support the idea of a more electronic-based system for the loan scheme. As I said in the first reading, Mr Speaker, when I was looking at some of the forms that were being used for student loan borrowers, when a constituent visited me in my office with a problem with their loan, I recognised the forms as ones that I had been part of designing as a student politician in the mid-1990s. So there's absolutely no doubt that the time has come to update the systems. An electronic system, as Mr Lotoinga said, will be very helpful for people overseas, and we do want people who are overseas to be able to pay their loans back and interact with the Inland Revenue Department in a sensible way. I do just have one issue around that, and that is the question of how this interacts with the redesign of the computer system at the Inland Revenue Department. It's quite clear that historically government agencies have struggled with large computer projects. Need I say INSYS to anybody in the House? And so I think it's important that as we go through this debate and in the committee stages, I have a number of questions for the Minister around the interaction between these changes to make electronic payments more easier and the overall change of the Inland Revenue Department's computer system. But overall, that is a very good aspect of the bill, and certainly one that we can support, because it will help borrowers manage their loans. It will help consistency of treatment between different borrowers, and that change is important to do. But Mr. Speaker, the two areas I want to speak about in the remainder of this call, and I certainly will come back to in the committee stages, are around the administration fee changes and around the changes to the pay period assessments. On the administration fee, it's difficult to understand exactly what the government is doing here. What we have is an increase to $60 for the fee for students drawing down a new loan, and a charge of $40 for borrowers. Now, a new charge is being introduced here.
Form of interest?
Well, that is the question, Mr. Hipkins, because when we look at the actual costs that are in front of us, is there actually any new increase in costs that would justify a change? And according to the regulatory impact statement, there actually isn't going to be any new cost. In fact, the new computer system should save money in the long run, subject to the questions that we will ask the Minister. So money is actually going to be saved. The whole thing should lead to a quicker repayments of loans, and so there's no additional costs there. So we have to ask ourselves, Mr. Speaker, why is a new fee being introduced when in fact the costs of running the scheme look like they might be going down as a result of this bill? And the conclusion that has to be drawn here is that a national government that was desperate to reintroduce interest on student loans, this was the policy John Key said he would oppose with every bone in his body.
Another broken promise.
And now we have a new fee being introduced, and it does look like the reintroduction of interest by stealth on student loans. That's what this new fee looks like, because there is not actually a justification for putting it in place. So, Mr. Speaker, when we get to the committee stages of this bill, we will certainly be wanting to ask questions about how justifiable is this new fee being introduced under this bill. We don't believe it is so. We believe that it is in fact the introduction of interest by stealth. A government that wants to reintroduce interest. John Key, Stephen Joyce have both gone as close as they can to saying they would like to reintroduce interest on student loans, but they know that they can't politically, so by stealth we have a new fee, a $40 fee introduced here for borrowers. I believe that is the equivalent of interest, and it is a clause in this bill that while we support the positive changes around the electronic system, we do not support the introduction of that fee, Mr. Speaker. The other matter, as I said, is around the question of the repayment period, and I do acknowledge here the work that the Select Committee has done in terms of the repayment period, because a number of concerns were raised both in the first reading debate and then by submitters, that in fact this change would be penalising students, particularly those who work intensively in holiday periods so that they don't have to work while they're studying. And if they were, for instance, to earn, say, more than $367 a week in one of those holiday periods, under the bill as introduced, they would be forced to make repayments on that. And that would be unfair, because that is the money that they were saving to be able to use during their study period. Now, I acknowledge that there have been changes to the bill, in particular to Clause 48, which I think will largely deal with that concern, and also changes to Clauses 73 through 89, which also deal with this. But when the Minister is in the chair in the committee stages, I wasn't on the Select Committee, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to ask some questions of the Minister in that period as to whether we have actually dealt with the question of making sure that those people who work intensively in their holiday periods will not be penalised under this law by moving from an annual pay assessment period to a pay period assessment. I think that's important, Mr. Speaker, because we actually don't want students working undue hours during their study period. We want them to be able to focus on their study. I think in the commentary of the bill there's a statement that we don't want people unnecessarily borrowing either. That's a different way of looking at it. But I think the Select Committee has made some good changes that will allay a lot of the concerns that we have on this side of the House about the way in which the assessment is changing from an annual assessment to a pay period one, but there are still questions to be answered to make sure that students are not unfairly penalised. So overall, Mr Speaker, we do support this bill, but we do have concerns around the administration fee and the repayment period, and we will be raising those in the committee stages.
I call David Bennett.
Just want to take a short call on the student loans